breaking down everyday workplace issues and diagnosing the hidden sickness, not just the obvious symptom. Our hosts, James and Kobe.
Did we lose a patient?
No, that's just my lunch.
Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm Kobe, he's James. Let's get started with a question. What is the role of labor unions in 2022?
That's a great question because honestly, the role for labor unions needs to evolve and largely hasn't since their heyday in like the 60s and 70s. And in my opinion, that's a large contributing factor to why unionization rates in Canada and the US are so low. Our public sector in Canada experiences fairly high unionization rates. If you're working for government or government funded agencies, there's a pretty good chance that you are a part of a union in Canada. If you're working in the private sector, on the other hand, by and large, the vast majority of people are not a part of a labor union. Whereas if you look at now it would be 50 or more years ago, unionization was huge, and it was seen as the ticket for many people to a long and successful career.
Yeah, and the whole idea of the impact that the unions kind of really had. I mean, not to go into our history lesson, but but the background context I think is kind of important. Because I mean, that's why we have like the 40-hour work week, the norms, the weekends. Yes. A lot of this kind of evolved from the early work, going back before the 60s and 70s. But even so, there really has been a strong history in shaping the workforce and shaping how we understand work. Really was largely impacted by unions. But absolutely, where we are now in 2022, I think it actually with another big shift to the workforce happened with COVID and the lockdowns. So I think this is a good time for us to be looking at unionization with some fresh eyes.
And the timing is really good because if you have been paying attention to workplace related news, you will have seen over the last couple of years a pretty significant increase in at least the publicity around labor unions and strike actions primarily. Like if we look over the last 3 years, Starbucks is a great example. In the past 3 years, they've had, or since the union drives have really started in earnest with Starbucks, over 300 of their stores have filed petitions to join a union. Over 200 of those stores have voted to unionize at this point, which is a huge and astonishing number in light of the numerous allegations of union busting efforts by Starbucks during this whole process. And then you've got Amazon, another very high profile company that has some very high profile labor disputes and some challenges. But there's the fact that there are, I think right now there's only about 2 warehouses, maybe that Amazon warehouses that have actually successfully unionized. But Amazon has been very public with their efforts to keep the union out of the workplace. And their success, I think it's the success of the Staten Island warehouse, has really driven an effort in Canada by trade unions to try to really focus on unionizing the Amazon workplaces here in Canada as well. We've seen some really public strike actions happen with Kellogg's, 1,400 workers who walked out over poor conditions and 2-tiered pay structures. It picked up a lot of publicity during COVID that this was going on with, videos and marketing material being produced by like Bernie Sanders camp to really let people know what's happening. And then, I mean, we're recording this early September 2022. School has just started back up in the last week or so, and Seattle teachers have formally gone on strike the day when most students return to school. And here in Canada, the Ontario Teachers Union is entering contract negotiations with the government, and the name calling and scare tactics have already started in the media. It's not that we haven't seen any strike action, or we haven't seen any unionization efforts over the last 20 or 30 years. The efforts have really been ongoing, but there seems to be a sense of a resurgence right now among certain sectors in retail, in food service, and traditionally in manufacturing. Is where we've seen a lot of the efforts kind of pop back up.
Yeah, and I think that one thing why I think it's really important for us to be talking about unions in a little bit different way is it's kind of like the idea of unions really hasn't evolved, as you said, kind of, for a long time. Like it's almost like we still think about unions in the same kind of old school way that we kind of think about, like healthcare, like diagnosing the workplace. So it's the healthcare. It's almost like unions are the same as like what leeches were thought of at resolving medical conditions, right? Like there's this really old, traditional understanding of what their role is and how they have how they impact things. But I think that one thing that we need to do is we need to update beyond the leeches. We need to move up to, some new value that can come from what unions can provide, because there is something that I think that we probably see in our work that maybe goes a bit missed by many people, because we are workforce specialists, we're workforce consultants. We see a lot of our job is to stay on top of major workforce factors and issues. And one thing that we do know is that there is a opportunities that unionized workplaces can provide, but part of the reason why they never seem to go to the potential that they could is part of this old school view that union equals bad, and so they have to be busted on the side of the workplace, or the public's like, oh, another union, or this. We need to almost come at them with some fresh eyes, because there is some real good or there's some really unique opportunities that can really come if we truly understand them. And I think I think the people that are listening need to understand, you actually have a really great perspective on a lot of this stuff. So you have worked in non-unionized environments, you've worked in unionized environments, you've been involved in unions, in locals, at provincial levels, at national levels. You've been on both sides of the table in companies that are organizations that have been have a union starting up, and you've been involved with ones that have fallen apart. So I think that you probably have a really well-rounded view about the pros and cons, and I think more importantly, the opportunity or the role that unions should have in 2022 and beyond.
Yeah, I do have a lot of experience working with unions and in unions and for unions. And let's be like, no opinion is unbiased. Right? That's kind of the definition of an opinion anyways. I certainly have a more favorable default in some respects, but what I really want to focus on is, and it's funny because we talked about the role of the unions, and that is what I want to talk about. But I don't want to confuse role with purpose. The purpose has always been the advancement of workers' rights. Unions formed out of a need to balance the inequality in power that was present in the workplace. And we're talking going back 100 to 120, 30, 40 years ago. That purpose remains the same, that a good union is focused on providing a good quality of wages, of experiences, making sure that the factors of the workplace are largely have a bit more balance than they would be if there was no collective action happening. There are fantastic examples of unions that have been successful in building that balance, and there are many examples of unions that have done a very poor job of that. To me, a union is successful when they help a business be successful.
Right.
And
I think that is a really, like, I'm going to cut you right off because I like to do that. I think that is a point that we should just sit on for a second, because no one benefits when either a union or a business is in it for the wrong reason and is taking advantage of their counterpart. Because I think one thing that we kind of need to kind of dismiss, early on in this podcast, is that as we go forward, we're talking about unions and businesses that are not in it to be corrupt, that are in it for the right reasons, are coming in with good faith. But I think it is important to acknowledge both organizations and unions are made up of flawed individuals.
Yeah.
That, people who can, that maybe were in it for the right reasons at the time and made poor decisions, or this or that. But I think that as long as both the businesses and the unions, everyone involved comes into the entire experience, the workplace, negotiations, all of it, kind of in good faith, and are willing to not assume that they're impervious to making mistakes and everything. I think it's important for us to say that that people can make those mistakes, but we really want to focus on the fact that there are people that the majority are in for the right reasons, and that's really who we're talking about when we kind of about businesses.
So you talked a little bit about my involvement. So to give you a little bit more context, I was involved in as vice president and chief steward in a local union in a previous career. I was involved in labor relations, contract negotiations, regional councils, occupational councils. I served on provincial board of directors. I was involved in unionization, in union drives. I was involved in supporting strike actions in other locals. I've been exposed to a lot of different aspects, and you are correct when you say, the vast majority of people are in it for the right reason. The common stumbling block that I have seen from my experience is that while people get involved for the right reasons, the environment is structured around conflict, and everything is very conflict centric, and the vast majority of people who get deeply involved in the labor movement, what I've seen is a tendency to swing to the extreme of all managers are out to get us, all bosses are bad. Mm-hmm. Because when you are immersed in conflict day in and day out, that becomes your baseline.
Right.
And for many of these people, they are stewards who are handling grievances, right? They are constantly in this state of conflict with management. And unfortunately, that translates to so many other aspects, and it becomes the default for many people, which hinders the ability for a union to really speak to what's important. And to me, what's important is, how do we help our members have a good quality of living? That's wages, benefits, and the factors of the workplace.
Yeah, and I think that again, it really is easy for, I mean, anyone that's been involved in a workplace, unionized or not, that is rife with conflict, knows how much that kind of like that taints the environment, and how much that really makes it challenging and hard to see things with a clear view, and can make things kind of difficult in general. But I think that when it comes to a lot of the issues that arise between organizations like the businesses and their unions, it is that in the assumption of the interactions, the negotiations, collective bargaining, kind of everything is kind of based on, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, but it's kind of based on this assumption that everything is a zero-sum game.
Well, it is. And because that's the way that we approach negotiations, right? We enter negotiations with the thought that in order for me to, doesn't matter what side of the table you're on, in order for me to get something, the other person has to give it up, right? That's kind of the definition of zero sum, is I gain by taking from somebody else. And that's how we largely approach negotiations from both sides of the table, right? We need to, from the business perspective, we need to keep these people from taking from us. From the union perspective is, we need to take our fair share, right? And that perspective bleeds over to the negotiations at the table.
Yeah. And from the outside, that's really easy to see how that could be, but I don't know, does it have to be that way?
There is going to be conflict. You have two groups that have differing objectives, right? Or at least we talk about them as differing objectives. And I think one of the challenges, to answer your question, the short answer is no. The long answer is no, but it doesn't have to be that way. We have to recognize that there's always going to be that give and take, that there's always going to be that that there's always going to be some conflict, because our objectives do not align perfectly. What would alleviate a lot of the challenges is the development of common language, right? If as a business, we could enter into negotiations with the labor union using the same language, it would help alleviate a lot of confusion, a lot of miscommunications. For example, we've talked about this a lot, and one of our big core theories is around what we call the 7x3 rule. And it's all about how the factors of your workplace need to be addressed through the lens of employees' expectations. 7 factors, 3 expectations. And this could actually be a really useful tool for both businesses and unions to frame the conversation, right? So if we look at, classic negotiation topic is wages, right? That's always going to be on the table.
That's a big one.
That's a big one. If we can approach our conversation about wages using the same language of those expectations, that wages need to be competitive, they need to be sufficient, and they need to be equitable.
Right.
From a business perspective, you want your wages to be competitive, sufficient, and equitable, because if they are not competitive, then people are going to go to your competitors for that higher wage. If they're not sufficient, then as in not enough for people to actually accomplish their goals or to live off of, then they're going to be looking for other ways to supplement their income. And if it's not equitable, you're going to land yourself in a whole host of problems, you know.
Yeah.
So A business wants their wages to be competitive, sufficient, and equitable, because it's foundational, and you can't have success in many of the other business areas that we talk about, like engagement, motivation, productivity. All of these things are dependent on whether or not there's high or low levels of job dissatisfaction.
Right.
Unions want competitive, sufficient, and equitable, right? They want their members to receive wages that are competitive within the industry and within the region. They want them to be sufficient, and sufficiency is actually a big one for many labor unions, right? They need to be sufficient to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. And from a wages perspective, we're largely talking about, can I support myself and or my family on the wages that I earn? And they need to be equitable. And the equitable piece is actually where most of the union's day-to-day activities take place, ensuring that things are equitably applied. That's where the role of local shop stewards and those activities play a big role in that equitable aspect. But just by framing our conversations through this same language, we will differ on what we consider to be competitive. We will differ on what we consider to be sufficient. But at least if we're using the same language, then we can talk about things in terms that both sides understand. And we know we have a common goal now, that we are trying to reach an agreement on what is competitive. We are trying to reach an agreement on what is sufficient, rather than we're trying to reach an agreement on wages as a big, broad topic. We can be more focused in our communication, in our conversations, and define those things together, those expectations.
Yeah. So what's interesting, so I give a lot of like talks, a lot of webinars, I speak at a lot of conferences and stuff like that. And one of our major areas that I've been talking about a lot this past year has been the kind of fallout of the Great Resignation,
Right.
the high turnover rates kind of happening globally. And a lot of the conversations that I have, the talks that I give, and the conferences, whenever, is often around the 7x3 rule. Again, competitive, sufficient, and equitable. And it's always interesting. I always love talking to people after we give a webinar, after we I speak at a conference, because people are always like, "Wow, yeah, we've always been so focused on competitive, and that's where all of our efforts are. But now that we know the expectations of the workforce have changed, and they really expect sufficient and equitable to be as important as competitive." And so what's really cool, and actually kind of I think one of the things that kind of opened up our eyes, is like I don't think you and I originally always thought about competitive, sufficient, and equitable in the union concept until people approached us about it. They're like, "Wow, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. Like, I'm an ERO for a union." And that idea is really interesting. And then I've spoken to HR heads or people responsible high up in different companies, and like, yeah, that language actually is something that would allow us to find that middle ground between talking with our unions and everything like that.
I want to be clear. This is not there are no like golden bullet solutions, right? Like,
Right.
it's not do this one. Companies hate this one trick, the
Clickbait.
clickbaity. Yeah. It's a starting point,
Yeah.
right? You need to enter into negotiations in good faith on
Right.
both sides. And when you don't, a whole host of things go wrong very, very quickly. If you can enter into negotiations in good faith and have a common language that both sides understand, it will help to alleviate many of the challenges that we experience during negotiations, right? It's not going to fix every problem immediately, but building that natural
Alignment
and alignment, right? There needs to be respect for the people who are sitting across the table from you. If you view them only from an adversarial perspective, then you may be successful at the negotiating table, but you're going to hurt yourself in the long run. A company that has a good union that is focused on, helping their members to, participate in the workforce, to be able, that are addressing the issues around equitability, that approaches a labor relations conversation as a partnership,
Mhm.
will be far more successful than those that go in swinging, right? And I've seen that. I've
Yeah.
seen I don't care what they say. This is what I want. This is what I'm getting. And damn anybody who gets in my way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because there are a lot of workplaces that think of or a lot. I don't even workplaces. A lot of people on both sides. Again, we talked about both are made up of flawed individuals. That kind of come in swinging, or they see, like, the organizations see the union as kind of like a cancer, and the the work and the union see the workplace as kind of like, something that's causing disease, or, and it gets really, like, messy and muddy and everything like that. But you're right. If they come in without this, or with this commonality, this middle ground. That's the language that people told me, and I think that's a great way to think about it. If competitive, sufficient, and equitable is the middle ground, then that's kind of that agreement of like almost like 80%, 75% of the the conversations that happen at the negotiation table are probably going to be about, if we come in agreeing on that, then what that means and what that looks like and how you measure and judge that makes the conversation much different, as opposed to kind of coming in swinging, or coming in with this, trying to tackle the huge issue of wages or job security or whatever. Because when we talk about the 7x3 rule, competitive, sufficient, and equitable are the three. The seven are things like working conditions, wages, safety, wellness, policies, job security, and then the consistency of work. But that I do think having that common language can actually almost make the relationship between an organization and a union a lot more mutually beneficial than if it's solely adversarial.
and I want to focus in on those 7 factors, because we asked the question at the beginning, what is the role of a labor union? Well, if you look historically and what it should be today, historically, unions have been focused on working conditions, on job security, on compensation, on all safety, on all of those factors that consistency of work, the factors that you just identified. The role for unions in 2022 is to focus on the factors of the workplace. Their role is 7x3, making sure that working conditions are competitive, sufficient, and equitable, making sure that job security is competitive, sufficient, and equitable, that consistency of work is competitive, sufficient, and equitable. If we want to answer the question of what is the role for a labor union in 2022, the answer is 7x3 rule.
Yeah, and so what's funny is that the 7x3 rule, it isn't. It's funny. It didn't come from a union background theory. It's actually a psychological theory that's been derived from Frederick Herzberg's theories called the motivation hygiene theory. That's about eliminating job dissatisfaction and the things that cause high turnover, disengagement, burnout. So it's actually an employee motivation concept.
Yes.
And so what's really funny is, if you think about it, the things that attribute to low motivation, high employee turnover, high burnout are the same kind of factors that unions are supposed to be focusing on, which makes sense to me as a workforce specialist, because we work with companies all over. And it's funny, when I see two comparable, say, manufacturing facilities, I can think of two in my mind right now. I'm not going to say who they are, but I can think about them. One of them is not unionized and has honestly a pretty terrible working conditions. The wages are competitive, but they're not sufficient or equitable. The policies are very one-sided. There's a lot of issues, and they suffer high employee turnover, low motivation, major burnout. They cannot keep people, and their plant is far less profitable, and honestly probably won't be around for a long time. When another plant is has a union, has a good union, has a good relationship with the union, and they have much higher retention, much higher engagement. They fill vacancies so quickly, and they have so much less vacancies. So it's kind of, in this sense, I wouldn't say it's just the union,
No, and I want to clarify. It's the approach to the conversation.
Yeah,
There's a mutual respect there.
Mhm.
Having worked with the companies, the senior leadership does not view the union as the enemy,
Right.
and the union does not view the company as the enemy.
Yeah, they both don't go into it as a zero-sum game.
Right. Now, it's not because they have a union.
Yeah, you're right.
It's because they have mutual respect, and the union has been successful in negotiating some key workplace factors like job security, like wages,
Wellness policy.
to wellness policies, which contribute to their very low turnover rates.
Yeah, absolutely. But also on the side of, like, we also see a lot of trends that happen with the workforce itself. But I mean, a lot of the draw to the unionized manufacturing plant as opposed to the non-unionized one is the union itself, to know, okay, because like there's almost like a minimum expectation of, okay, I know these things are going to be there because that's what the union has fought for and provided, and it's reinforced, where the other one's like, I don't know what this company is going to be like, and so it's not, you're right, and I shouldn't imply that union magically solved all the problems, but the right environment, the right approach, the right mindset, the common ground, the middle ground does make a big difference. And I think that we talk about what the role of unions in 2022 and even beyond should be. I think that there's a missed opportunity if that's not a big part of what they're trying to achieve. Because I mean, reducing job, because like all companies want to reduce job dissatisfaction, increase employee retention, reduce a lot of the burnout and safety accidents, and so there's stuff that unions are responsible or should be focused on, and if they're both acting in good faith, can achieve that, actually have a lot of great business outcomes if done properly.
Yes, and there's benefits to a business in having a good union. Let's qualify that. But a good union also recognizes that a business is in business to make a profit, and that profit is not in and of itself a bad thing.
Right.
Like, there has to be recognition from the union that this entity, this business that we are negotiating with, has objectives that have to be met. And a good union will recognize that the success of the company will increase the success of their membership, which should be their focus, right? Like, it should really, it's
a symbiotic relationship.
It sounds pie in the sky to say, oh, it should be a happy relationship. It's not always going to be a happy relationship, right? No. There are contradicting perspectives and outcomes, but it can be a mutually respectful relationship.
Yeah, well, it is a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, one requires the success of the other. A workplace can't be sustainable if it weakens and damages the long-term success of its employees. And a union can't be successful if the business that employs its members, if it weakens and brings down the company, then both futures are tied together. And so that respect and acknowledgement has to be there. That has to almost be a fundamental part of going into it. But I think, like I said, going into it, and again, maybe it's simple in my mind, but my mind's kind of simple at times too anyway. But the idea of, like, that the unions and the organizations, there's a symbiotic relationship. They need one another to succeed. If they go in with good faith and with common language, they can probably take a big chunk out of the major issues that are addressing both the employees and the businesses themselves to be sustainable and successful in the future.
I think I love where the conversation has gone. I do think there's one aspect that we've glossed over that, if we don't address, would be a significant oversight. And that's the fact that not all businesses approach the perspective of unionization as a potentially positive impact. And what's that?
The majority of them don't.
Right. And so the question that comes from that is, how do you get to a point where you can have a conversation based on mutual respect? If you look at some of the examples that I listed when we started, Starbucks and Amazon have been very, very public with their intentions and the activities and the amount of money that they've invested in making sure that the union fails. Mm-hmm. How do you then enter into negotiations in good faith, right? Yeah. How do you then enter in negotiations with a sense of mutual respect? Yeah. And this is why, when we talk about things, there's work on both parts, and businesses need to come to the realization that if you approach negotiations from a different perspective, you can achieve better business outcomes. Right. But that is only going to happen if we can get people thinking about labor relations from the perspective of the 7x3 rule. In my mind, answering the question of how do we get there is our conversations need to be permeated with this language of competitive, sufficient, and equitable. If we can get both sides to agree on language, then we can build the mutual respect. But that's not going to happen until people on both sides of the table are willing to negotiate in good faith and attempt to find some common language.
Right. No, I think that's great. So I think I'll actually summarize this entire talk. You did a good job there, but I'll just put a little cherry on top of it. So what is the role of unions in 2022? Well, we've seen a bit of a revitalization in unions in the past little while after a big decline in unionization over a much longer history of 50 years or so. But a lot of this is coming to that there are a lot of businesses and unions that kind of come into negotiations with the wrong attitude. And often it's because we all have to acknowledge that there's flawed individuals that exist on both sides. But the mistake that we can often make when we're trying to carve out our mutual success is going into conversations as if they are a zero-sum game, that I can only succeed if you fail. And I think that what we need to do is reframe our approach to having to our conversations around unions and what unions can be, and start looking at the common language that could exist by leaning into the 7x3 rule, which is the idea that factors of the workplace like working conditions, wages, safety, wellness, policies, job security, and consistency need to be all competitive, sufficient, and equitable. And if we do that, we could create a middle ground between unions and workplaces that will allow for a common goal of removing job dissatisfaction that would benefit unions by helping get the working conditions and environment that give employees what they need to have success, and actually allow businesses to retain and engage and motivate employees at a much higher level. And that's possible if we attack things with common language, in good faith, and we look at this as a mutually beneficial opportunity instead of a war. And I think that kind of summarizes it. Any last comments, James?
No, that's great. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you're listening to us or watching this. Let us know what you think. What is the role for unions in 2022 and beyond? We'd love to hear your thoughts. So,
yeah. And feel free to send those messages right to James on Twitter at James from Roman 3. So he loves you. Yeah, he would love to hear your opinions on that. And so feel free to absolutely do that. Yeah. So I guess that about does it for us. So for a full archive of our podcast and access to the video versions hosted on our YouTube channel, visit roman3.ca/podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
For more information on topics like these, don't forget to visit us at roman3.ca. Side effects of this podcast may include improved retention, high productivity, increased market share, employees breaking out in spontaneous dance, dry mouth, aversion to the sound of James's voice, desire to find a better podcast.